In the last lecture module, we looked at the two major ontological frameworks that have played a significant role in thought and theorizing in the period between the Enlightenment and the early parts of the 20th century. We looked at different tweaks or changes or modifications to the structure of those frameworks to see if they helped make any progress in resolving those problems that we've identified as inherent to the way in which those frameworks are composed and operate. And I suggested that nothing that we saw amongst those various permutations really changed the fundamental dynamics for either oppositional substance dualism or monism. You might think, wow, this has been a long 4-week walk to it's a mystery. But that isn't really the takeaway. The takeaway so far is simply that the solutions, if there are solutions to the quandaries that face oppositional substance dualists or monists, aren't going to be found in relatively superficial adjustments to their basic view. Instead, they will be resolved by hard work figuring out how it is that those frameworks can be modified and tied to the world in a way that allows for the formulation of dynamic theories, the testing of dynamic theories, the ability to make more and better rigorous predictions, retrodictions, manipulations, and explanations. And the work that was done primarily during this period from the Enlightenment to the beginning of the 20th century was to engage in this practice of normal philosophy whereby they debated the relative merits of or promise of the different kinds of ontological frameworks and their permutations that were out there and available. So we're going to go ahead and review some of those arguments now and talk about them as well. The first arguments that we'll look at are arguments that would purport to elevate oppositional substance dualism or to diminish substance monism. And the first argument that we want to look at is the modern argument from Leibniz's law. That is, the identity of indiscernibles. Now, Descartes uses a version of this argument in the Meditations, but he doesn't have Leibniz's law, so it isn't quite as rigorous or well specified as this version will be, hopefully. Premise 1, I can easily imagine my body being chopped up and placed into garbage bags and scattered about town. Hence, my body is divisible. This is a fundamental property of physical objects in Descartes' Meditations. They are divisible by nature. So for him, it's easy to imagine dividing up any physical body whatsoever. I cannot imagine my mind being chopped up. Hence, my mind is not divisible. And in fact, he supposes in the Meditations that one of the fundamental properties of mind is that it has no extension, it is indivisible. If my mind was just my body, that is, if they were identical, then by Leibniz's law, or the identity of indiscernibles, I should be able to imagine my mind being chopped up. If I understand one object to have a property, then if they are identical, the other object must have that property as well. That is, if A is identical to B, that is, if the body is identical to the mind, then if the body has a property, the mind must have that property as well. If I can imagine my body being chopped up, my body has that property, and therefore my mind must have that property as well. And so Descartes concludes that your mind is not identical to your body. Now, unfortunately, this argument uses an illicit application of Leibniz's law, or the identity of indiscernibles. In certain circumstances, statements can be made that are not substitutable salva veritata. They are referentially opaque. That is, it's not obvious whether or not they're both true or false, or one's true and the other's false, precisely because their reference isn't completely determinate within that context. Whenever that happens, it's illegitimate or ill-advised or not valid to apply Leibniz's law, or the identity of indiscernibles. I'll give you some examples in the textbook, but we can actually just use the mind as our example in this particular case. So Descartes says it's easy for him to imagine his body being chopped up, or a body, any body, because they are divisible. But it's not easy to imagine the mind being chopped up. However, since many functions of our mind, many capacities that we have are localized within the brain, damage to a specific area takes out that particular functionality. So, for example, if you get damage to Broca's or Wernicke's areas that facilitate language processing, then you would develop Broca's or Wernicke's aphasia. That is, you will lose part of your mind with that part of your body that you lost. So it's not impossible for me to imagine them once I get a sense of how they could be co-referential. And that means this argument is not going to work to establish that there are two different kinds of substances.